Thank you for coming to this. This is the formal kickoff for the Center for Catholic Studies for this year. We have actually already hosted an event. Earlier this semester, we did the first in a series called Communicating Catholicism, which featured Brenda Noriega of Boston College talking about communicating with young adults. The next entry in that series, in fact, will be on the 16th of October, when John Grosso, who actually used to do some digital media for the Diocese of Bridgeport, will be talking to us about communicating Catholicism in a presentation that he's titling Tweeting and Tradition. He does social media for a variety of different Catholic things, and he'll talk about the careful dance between what people need, what they need to know, being respectful of tradition, and things like that. Later in October will be our next major lecture when Jason King will present the work of a recent survey on the value of Catholic higher education. And in November, Professor Hasman Ospino, who spoke to us last year about this time, will talk to us about the American Catholic experience in a lecture on November 13th that we have timed to be a week after the election. He'll talk to us about how the American Catholic narrative is going forward, and in fact, how Hispanic Catholics are engaging with the American Catholic experience. So let's get to it. I'm extremely thrilled to have our speaker making a return trip to Fairfield, and I'm happy to invite Professor Mary Kate Holman to the podium to introduce her. They are old friends, which is a beautiful thing. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Dr. Susan Bigelow Reynolds is Assistant Professor of Catholic Studies at Emory University's Candler School of Theology. She holds a PhD from Boston College, just up the road, where she and I overlapped for a year during our master's degrees a little over a decade ago. It's a real honor to have her here at Fairfield today and to share a bit about her work with all of you. Reynolds' research brings together Catholic theology and ethnography, examining the intersection of ecclesiology and lived Catholicism in contexts of diversity, marginality, and suffering. Her well-received first book, People Get Ready, Ritual, Solidarity, and Lived Ecclesiology in Catholic Roxbury, which came out from Fordham University Press in 2023, draws on years of parish-based ethnographic research in Boston to examine the question of community in a racially and culturally diverse church, arguing for the retrieval of solidarity as an ecclesial virtue. Among other accolades, People Get Ready won the College Theology Society Book Award this year. Reynolds' research has also examined public ritual, urban Catholic practice, parish closures and congregational change, migration, motherhood and pregnancy loss, and the Catholic clergy sexual abuse crisis, some of which topics we will hear about this evening. My students in Intro to Catholicism were particularly moved and challenged by Reynolds' 2023 article entitled, "I Will Surely Have You Deported, Undocumenting Clergy Sexual Abuse in Immigrant Communities," which won the Lacunia Award of the Catholic Theological Society of America last year. Reynolds' work also has a public-facing dimension. She is a contributing writer for Commonweal magazine and is a frequent contributor to national conversations on Catholicism and public life in the media, including NPR, the PBS NewsHour, NBC, and CNN. So please join me in welcoming my friend Susan Bigelow Reynolds.
Thank you so much for that lovely, generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Just getting situated here. It's so wonderful to be back with you all. I was telling Mary Kate the last time I was here to give a lecture. Nancy had invited me, and I was very, very newly pregnant with my third daughter, and I was very ill, but trying to keep it together. But I was absolutely exhausted and extremely sick, and I left, and I thought, how did that go? I wonder if they're ever going to have me back. So I am thrilled that the answer to that question is yes. I'm so grateful to the O'Callahan family and to Nancy and Mary Kate and to the community here at Fairfield for the invitation to join you all this evening. As you can tell from the title of my presentation, Theologizing the Local After Clergy Abuse and Parish Closure. We're going to have a grand old time tonight. We're discussing some very, very uplifting topics. We'll also be touching on racism. So get excited. This is good. We're going to have a great time. What we're going to talk about is the topic of place. And so I'm going to begin by telling you all a little bit about the place that I'm from. I have been forever enchanted with Catholic notions of place. Long before I understood this in categorical terms, I felt it. I was born and raised in Colorado at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, and my experiences of the faith as a young girl were deeply entwined with my experience of growing up on the Front Range. In 1993, World Youth Day came to Denver. Maybe a few of you in this room have participated in a World Youth Day before. I was not a youth so much, I was 6. But my memories of it are very vivid. I can still recall waking up before dawn for Mass at Cherry Creek Reservoir State Park. That's what this aerial shot is. This is 1 million people gathered for Mass on the hottest day of the year, I remember. I can still picture the sun beating down on the million of us, the iridescent clouds rolling over the mountains, the smell of dry prairie grass in August. That year's World Youth Day logo, right here, fabulously early 90s, was a stylized image, as you can see, of a cross and human figures dancing in praise in front of some zigzag mountains. And for decades to come, that logo, I actually still have a World Youth Day t-shirt, believe it or not, because you know how your mom buys you things and you're like, it'll be a night shirt, but like I'm 6, but it was an adult medium. And so I actually still have it in my drawer, which is really wild. For decades to come, that logo would become the image that I implicitly associated with the word church, something simple and joyful and mountainous. As I grew up, this thoroughly Coloradoan sense of the faith only deepened. In high school youth choir, we would sit on the hillside behind church and sing Rich Mullins songs as the sun set over the Rockies. The parish that I went to was built in the early 1970s. So it was built with dark brick and olive green and burnt orange carpet and the Western. It was like the heady reception of Vatican II, threw up and became a church. And the western facing wall wasn't stained glass, it was just plate glass. And so I would daydream through Mass, obviously, staring out the window as the sun's rays did what my siblings and I call the Lion King thing. Raining down ribbons of clouded light onto the face of Mount Evans. If you've ever been to Denver, that big mountain right in the middle there is Mount Evans, which actually I believe has just been renamed Mount Blue Sky. My youth group would go on retreats out to the eastern plains, just shy of Nebraska, to a campsite made of dugout huts. We called it Peace Huts, where we would, note this is true, channel the life of St. Francis and sing the song from the 1972 movie Brother, Sun, and Sister Moon, which I will not regale you with at this moment, but it is very, very hippie and awesome. So transubstantiation required no grand leap of the imagination for me, because it made perfect sense that God could transform your local, everyday fruit of the vine and work of human hands into Christ's body and blood. My own body felt like it could well have been carved out of the pines and plains, and my own blood funneled from a glacier stream somewhere. The spiritual value I assigned to place is illustrated well by the work of well-known poet and writer Wendell Berry. Berry's writing embraces a vision of sort of agrarian simplicity and commitment to a kind of hidden life of groundedness and stability that resonated deeply with this desire I felt to be very much from some place. His poem, The Place That You Belong To, has a few stanzas that capture the spirit of what I mean, so I'll read it to you. Speak to your fellow humans as your place has taught you to speak, as it has spoken to you. Speak its dialect as your old compatriots spoke it before they had heard a radio. Speak publicly what cannot be taught or learned in public. Listen privately, silently to the voices that rise up from the pages of books and from your own heart. Be still and listen to the voices that belong to the stream banks and the trees and the open fields. There are songs and sayings that belong to this place, by which it speaks for itself and no other. Found your hope then on the ground under your feet, your hope of heaven. Let it rest on the ground underfoot. So I grew up to study the inner lives of Catholic communities, in large part, I think, because of how deeply place played a role in the formation of my own religious imagination. And as it turned out, my youthful intuitions weren't too far from how Catholic theologians tend to think about communion and ecclesial belonging. Catholicism fundamentally is a faith practiced in places. To study Catholicism is to study places, street corners and shrines and grottos and living rooms and pilgrimages and, of course, parishes. The parish in particular is defined by locality. Technically, you don't belong to a parish because you like it, or you like the music, or the pastor, or the mission statement, or the people there. You belong to a parish because you live near the parish. Rather than invitation or tithing or formal enrollment, parish belonging is determined principally by existing in a place and showing up. Even today, when few Catholics, I would say myself included, feel particularly obligated to attend the parish within whose boundaries they reside over some other one that they like better, parish life remains fundamentally shaped by territoriality. And so, in turn, are Catholic understandings of church and community. The relationship between ecclesial belonging and local dwelling is reflected in Catholic sacramental theology and practice. The Eucharist, argued Karl Rahner, is Christ's becoming incarnate in a particular place, among a particular people. The parish is the place where the church becomes event, he argues. So in sum, we can say that one of Catholicism's defining features is the way it privileges the holiness of the local. My first book, which Mary Kate mentioned, People Get Ready, tells the story of a small underground parish in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood that played a sort of outsized role in the struggle for social justice and civil rights in the city throughout the 20th century. I spent a year living in the church's parish house, and I fell in love with the kind of granular details that made St. Mary of the Angels the place that it was. In addition to a room of my own and all of the potluck leftovers I could eat, my year in the parish house afforded me really the rarest of opportunities, which was the chance to experience the life of a parish from the inside out. There's a reason why most intimate portraits of Catholic parish life have been written by men, and usually priests. Within the hierarchy of the church, as we know, clerical status affords a researcher both a more direct path to parish insiderhood and, in the eyes of parishioners, research subjects, so-called, the presumption of credibility. Like, I trust you, I trust what you're doing, but who's this lady? Women may be the heartbeat of parish ministry, but our authority tends to stop at the rectory door. So it felt to me both a tremendous privilege, but also more than a little subversive, I would say, to be a 24-year-old laywoman living in a parish house, in a church rectory. My year in the rectory was an exhilarating immersion in the ordinary. The too long meetings and fiery debates over how best to extend the life of the printer cartridge in the office, the echo of sirens at night, the riotous laughter of the church matriarchs who would linger in the parish house after daily mass to drink coffee and watch The Price is Right. These moments were their own kind of revelation, right? A sort of glimpse of the deep and abiding continuity between church and neighborhood, between ritual and the rhythm of everyday life. So in exchange for our rooms above the kitchen, my parish house roommate, Catherine, who is also a master's student at BC at the time, and I did a host of odd jobs in pastoral work. On Saturday mornings, we helped to clean the church with a weekly rotation of volunteers from the Spanish and English-speaking communities. I taught fifth grade catechesis classes, poorly mostly, and compiled the Sunday bulletin. Catherine gave Spanish lessons to some of the English-speaking older women and led communion services in the chapel on mornings when there was no priest to say weekday masses. And my favorite task was after the 2 Sunday masses, it was our job to set out the giant vat of bad coffee and a few dozen Dunkin' Donuts, but we had to cut them into quarters. So that it was really more of the idea of a donut than having a whole donut. It was a symbolic of a donut, because there was absolutely the parish budget was non-existent. So it was a foretaste of the larger donut that they may have someday. The work that I do as a theologian and ethnographer, and for those who aren't familiar with that latter word, ethnography is a mode of research in which one immerses oneself in the lived reality of a community, a people, a culture, originally drawn from the field of cultural anthropology, but now in an increasing way used in theology and religious studies. So I'm a theologian and an ethnographer. And the work that I do is built on this love of, and even I would say perhaps an obsession with, the hyper-local, especially with the sort of hidden, marginal places that scholars tend to overlook as sites of serious inquiry. Falling in love with the people and the community at St. Mary of the Angels was very easy. And it was hard at times not to slip into viewing this community with a certain romanticism, even as my daily interactions laid bare the messiness of human interrelationships. Only slowly and through sustained engagement with colleagues in studying American Catholicism, primarily from feminist and post-colonial perspectives, did I begin to appreciate more fully, though, the moral ambivalences of the local in Catholic life. When I moved to Boston, it had been 9 years since the Boston Globe's 2002 Spotlight reports exposed decades of clergy sexual abuse and cover-ups. We tend to think of the Spotlight expose as like one article, but actually it was a series of articles over the course of many, many years. This was the first one published just after the new year in 2002. The revelations of the abuse, of the cover-ups, of the scale of the whole thing had blown through the archdiocese like a wildfire, and the flames were very much still smoldering when I arrived almost a decade later. The crisis devastated Boston Catholics' trust in the church hierarchy, and ignited calls, among other things, for greater lay leadership and authority. Organizations like Voice of the Faithful came out of this, for example. 2 years after the abuse revelations came to light, Archbishop Sean O'Malley announced the impending closure of more than 80 of Boston's smallest and most financially unstable parishes. The wave of closures forced nearly 30,000 Catholics to find new parish homes, further upending these communities that had already suffered from this real deep sense of institutional betrayal in the wake of the Spotlight exposés. St. Mary's parishioners were stunned to find their church, despite its thriving social justice ministries and its vibrant intercultural community, they were stunned to find it on the closure list. Neighbors and parishioners launched a solidarity campaign aimed at convincing the Archdiocese that St. Mary's was too vital to the stability of the neighborhood to close. And the campaign became actually one of very few success stories in the wave of resistance that erupted across the Archdiocese in the wake of the shutdown. So the protest was actually successful, but we'll talk about that in a bit. So clergy abuse cover-ups, right? Parish closures. These two were stories about place. These two were stories about the local, about communities. But they were different kinds of stories. They were stories of an institutional church whose administrative and hierarchical structure wielded power through geographical mastery. by claiming authority over places and communities. These were stories in which church leaders exercised that authority by shuffling priests and faithful from place to place across world maps parceled out into parishes and dioceses like a giant game of Risk. So this evening, I want to examine how certain wounds in the life of the church today call for a critical turn in theological approaches to geography and land and space. I'll invite us to consider 3 such wounds in particular by telling different stories drawn from the work that I did in Boston: racial injustice, clergy sexual abuse, and the pain of parish closures. Informed, as I said, by feminist and post-colonial commitments to reading histories from the undersides, I'll invite us to rethink local belonging in light of these signs of the times. By the end of our time together this evening, I hope that I'm able to show why it matters that we think more critically about the often invisible forces that have produced the places that we love, including our local churches. So, topic 1, we're going to talk about redlining and the production of the inner cities. So the defining characteristic of St. Mary of the Angels in Roxbury was its diversity. Since its establishment in 1906, the parish had encompassed some of the city's starkest and most consequential borderlines. By the 1920s, the parish boundaries encompass the contentious borderline between Catholic and Jewish-occupied blocks of Upper Roxbury. In the 1940s and 50s, African Americans moving northward during the Great Migration settled in the neighborhood, eventually catalyzing urban white flight and transforming St. Mary's into a home for Black Catholics. Successive migrations from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic prompted the addition of a Spanish Mass at St. Mary's in 1971. By 1979, St. Mary's also had become a religious and social hub for Catholic Laotian Khmu refugees in the city, while a Haitian community prompted the ad hoc addition of French and Creole ministries. By the 1980s, this tiny church was sustaining a community of some 40 nationalities. If the 20th century was supposed to be a story of upward mobility for American Catholics, St. Mary's had apparently missed the memo. Mid-century Catholicism traded on an image of stability, right? Sort of proving its American bona fides by publicly binding together the Catholic faith with symbols of national stability, so like military service, the Hollywood silver screen, suburban life, the white nuclear family, the university, the presidency, right? Think of how many movies about nuns there were in the 1960s. There are like so many movies about nuns. Like how many movies about nuns are there coming out today? Like unless there's a nun in the Marvel series that I don't know about because I've never seen it, there's I think 0. A completely unrelated aside is that we always make fun of my mom because she can tell you absolutely every single thing about any actress that ever played a nun in a 1960s movie. Like, she's like, oh, that's so-and-so, and she played sister. And we're like, that's a very specific knowledge, Mom. In its own way, the American parish during these years emblematized this stability, right? Mapping notions of holiness and sacramentality onto territorial belonging. St. Mary's was really the antithesis of this facade, both sort of predating it and also outlasting it. In many ways, the community it served represented the underside of that history, the untold story of urban Catholic life on Boston's social, economic, and ecclesial peripheries. If European Catholic immigrants spent the 20th century becoming white, as the popular publication put it, the people of St. Mary's spent much of that same period negotiating their place within a church that the National Black Catholic Clergy Caucus in 1968 called, quote, a primarily white racist institution. I initially wanted to see St. Mary's as some kind of intercultural and interracial utopia, right? A community that was able to sustain this anomalous and deeply beautiful kind of diversity through its liturgical practices and social justice commitments alone. But there was more to it than that. And that more mattered just as much for what it meant to think about the task of the church in that particular place. So this is a map from 1938. In 1938, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, Holk, produced what they called a residential security map of Boston and a lot of other cities in the United States. And they graded each part of these cities A through D, A being your good neighborhoods, B, C, and then D being your highest risk neighborhoods, highest risk for investment. Comments on the map note, quote, an infiltration of foreigners and Negroes, Jews, and relief families, welfare families. They designated Roxbury in particular as, quote, hazardous for investment, and encouraged lenders, banks, to deny home loans to the area. And this is a practice that's known as redlining. So if you've heard of redlining before, that's what redlining is. Basically, this was a map that went out to lenders across America that said, oh, if somebody wants to buy a house in this area, not a good idea. Don't give them a home loan if they want to buy in this area. So what happens? Rates of home ownership plummet. People are destabilized. Communities are destabilized. The kind of taxes that you get from home ownership in a particular area are siphoned away, and you essentially create poverty in places that it didn't necessarily exist before, and in ways that would go on to last for decades and decades and decades. As historian John McGreevy has demonstrated in a classic text on called Parish Boundaries, about parish boundaries, which you think, wow, that doesn't sound very interesting, but surprise, it's very interesting. White Euro-American parochial belonging structured residential communities and prevented integration from taking roots in neighborhoods throughout the 20th century urban North. Parish boundaries were very complex in their effects. On one hand, especially for new immigrants, parishes provided social solidarity and cultural refuge and promoted civic empowerment. On the other, as McGreevy demonstrates, these same parish enclaves often became rallying points for bigotry, as Catholics proved unable to separate community from racial mythology. Those are McGreevy's words. McGreevy notes that historical records report startlingly high rates of home ownership among working class immigrant Catholics, rates that exceeded even those of their more highly educated and wealthier, more successful American-born Jewish and Protestant counterparts. Why did Catholics own their homes at such high rates? Home ownership was encouraged often by pastors. It was encouraged by church leaders. Home ownership slowed Catholics' participation in urban white flight because it sort of forced them to commit to their neighborhoods. But when people owned their homes, the thought was, oh, well, others that are undesirable to this neighborhood will not move in. So it was a very double-edged sword. Home ownership slowed Catholics' participation in urban white flight, thus serving at once as a stabilizing force for parishes and as a bulwark in maintaining the religio-racial purity of predominantly white Catholic neighborhoods in places like Boston and Chicago. Virulent Catholic opposition to residential and school integration efforts in cities like Boston meant that northern cities remained even more segregated than southern cities. And in certain cases, that's still true today. By the early 1960s, however, white residents of Roxbury were moving en masse to the suburbs. And in so doing, they're taking their jobs and industries and tax revenues with them. The white parishioners who remained at St. Mary's were aging also. Meanwhile, younger African-American families in growing communities from Puerto Rico and Cape Verde and Trinidad and Cuba and Haiti and elsewhere had settled in the neighborhoods around Eggleston Square, which is the sort of area where the parish is located. In Roxbury, people of color faced a matrix of oppression exacerbated by the siphoning effect of suburbanization and decades of redlining. As Massachusetts State Representative and legendary Boston community activist Mel King later put it, the systematic denial of jobs, housing, education, and political representation by the Boston power structure came to full development in the creation of the ghetto. For the image of the ghetto allowed the ruling elite to blame the Black community for what they had systematically imposed upon us. Viewed as the epicenter of urban decline, Roxbury came to be seen by city officials and archdiocesan authorities alike as the consummate Boston ghetto, the notorious sort of problem child of inner city Boston. Blighted neighborhoods around Roxbury were the targets of 1960s era urban renewal projects, some of which did more to displace poor Black residents than they did to meaningfully rejuvenate the area. Exacerbating Roxbury's decline was the prospect of a massive 8-lane highway project that was slated to cut directly through the heart of the parish boundaries, directly through the heart of Eggleston Square. To clear land for this expressway, the city had begun to displace residents by eminent domain, most of whom were low-income minorities and immigrants. Precarious neighborhoods were torn apart, homes were razed. Neighborhood activists from Roxbury and other surrounding areas, Jamaica Plain, Hyde Park, and South End, and many St. Mary's parishioners among them, united in 1969 to actually stop the catastrophic highway project, and it didn't end up going forward. But the damage had already been done. The land had already been cleared. Destabilizing Roxbury neighborhoods also destabilized its parishes. For the church in Boston, the city's massive racial divide was also a parochial divide. As a Boston Redevelopment Authority report later observed, as the wave of suburbanization swept across the country, Boston was sorely impacted, but Roxbury was devastated. Middle and upper class white Catholics were increasingly found in suburban parishes, while predominantly poor Black and Hispanic Catholics were disproportionately concentrated in urban centers and worshiped in under-resourced inner-city parishes like St. Mary's. For some archdiocesan leaders, the racial divide had become a source of major pastoral concern, even as ecclesial dynamics sort of contributed to the rift. Virulent racism was a persistent feature of the Boston Catholic landscape. Boston's Cardinal Cushing often took really bold public stances against racism, decrying the hypocrisy of white Catholics who, he said, participated in the sacraments on Sunday, yet spent the rest of the week with their backs turned to their neighbors of color. He once bluntly reminded believers that the consequence for the sin of racism is hell. This is an actual quote from a press release that he put out. The price of segregation here below may well be segregation for all eternity from the company of the elect. That's a heavy statement. That's a strong statement. But despite his fervent and repeated and really continuous appeals to Catholic social doctrine to denounce racism, and despite the efforts of interfaith organizations and Catholic organizations alike, white Catholic attitudes on race remained virtually unchanged during the 1960s. In 1965, one such organization wrote that, quote, "The majority of Negroes is now convinced beyond any doubt that the majority of white Catholics, lay and cleric, is against them. Black Catholics find themselves, quote, facing a crisis of faith by reason of the fact that the white voters of Boston, overwhelmingly Catholic, seem to have locked the door to the ghetto and thrown away the key." Indeed, as some of you may be familiar with, the racist upheaval over busing-based school integration that would define the 1970s, the following decade, would be led largely by white Catholic parents. What's striking to observe is the way in which the 1938 Red Line Maps designation of essentially good and bad neighborhoods became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? This area that I have circled right there is Eggleston Square, right in the heart of which is St. Mary of the Angels Parish. And this area would go on to experience some of the most searing poverty and violence of any neighborhood in Boston. So what's the lesson? Right? You're like, I don't live in Boston. What's the lesson here? It's a Wednesday. The lesson is that places don't just appear. Right? Places don't just appear. Redlining produced inner cities. Redlining produced ghettos. it produced poverty. Catholic ecclesiologists, those who study the church, want to romanticize the parish as a site of local communion, advocating for an embrace of the territorial parish as a place where Catholics come together across all kind of boundary lines. And that's true in some respects, and that's well and good, and we love that. But we would be even better served to interrogate sort of 1, 2, 3 layers deeper, to interrogate the economic, the political, the social forces that created the places we live in and worship in, the decisions of homeowners, the decisions of real estate agents, banks, lenders, policymakers, business owners, church leaders. As long as parish belonging is determined territorially, residential segregation is indelibly mapped onto parochial segregation, and we owe it to ourselves as theologians, as researchers, to ask the hard questions about how the places that we live in came to look exactly like they are. So that's one dynamic that I want to raise. The second is clergy abuse. And I'll tell another St. Mary the Angel story. So during the 1970s, Roxbury clergy would occasionally get together to discuss the problems facing the church in the inner city. They would, discuss the concerns in their parishes and their neighborhoods, and then write letters to the archdiocese, making demands of leaders who would ignore them and then go on with their lives. And the great thing about doing archival research is that you get to read a lot of dead people's mail. And you get all of these letters were saved. And so you get this real-time sort of narration of the real problems facing these communities, and also the ways that they were just systematically ignored by the people receiving these letters, who filed them away for some earnest young theologian to discover decades later. In the minutes from a meeting in June 1976, a priest at St. Joseph's Parish, which was another nearby parish in Roxbury, complained, this is in the minutes, that one problem was that bishops seemed to be sending so-called displaced priests to the inner city. This was obviously a euphemism, displaced priests. The remark was striking for several reasons. And the first time I read it, I took it at face value. Not exactly face value, because I knew that displaced was code for something. But I took it at face value like, gosh, wow, that's something to pursue. That's really interesting. But then I did a little more digging. And the remark became very striking. And the reason that it was striking was that the priest who made the remark was named Father Doja Wilson. And he had firsthand knowledge of bishops' propensities to send displaced clergy to inner city parishes. Wilson himself was ordained in the Diocese of Albany, New York. In 1976, Wilson was accused of sexually abusing 2 boys from Sacred Heart School, where he was assigned. And instead of prosecuting him, the bishop at the time, Edwin Broderick, and the district attorney, Saul Greenberg, agreed to let him leave the area. So the bishop and the DA agreed, we'll just let this guy go somewhere else and become somebody else's problem. So Wilson moved to Boston, where he became parish administrator at St. Joseph's in Roxbury in 1976, under the auspices of Cardinal Umberto Medeiros, storied author of Man, Cities, and God's Poor, storied advocate for the poor in Boston. In 2003, Wilson was accused of having sexually abused a 15-year-old boy at St. Joseph's beginning in 1976, the year that he was assigned there. According to reports, Wilson had brought the boy and his younger brother with him from Albany to live with him in the Roxbury Rectory. Wilson was sent to a treatment center, a House of Affirmation in Worcester, in 1978, and left St. Joseph's on April 30th, 1979, and was basically chased out of there, also by people who did not want to report him to authorities, and that's where the record on him ends. In the study of clergy sexual abuse, there's a dynamic that's often referred to as the geographical solution. and that is this. It's the practice of bishops or superiors, religious superiors, for example, dealing with abusive clergy in their ranks by sending them away to remote rural dioceses, often in the American Southwest and Northwest, Alaska, for example, often in Native American communities, sometimes internationally to missions in Latin America and elsewhere. It turned these receiving communities, again, often Native American or Mexicano or Latino, into dumping grounds. It's another term that's used in the literature a lot, dumping grounds for abusive clergy. So leaders viewed these marginal communities as collateral damage, right, in this larger and more important project of rehabilitating problem priests by sending them away to the frontier or to the mission field, while also not coincidentally ensuring that they evaded prosecution and the church evaded scrutiny. So what I discovered as I wrote People Get Ready was that a parallel geographic solution was at play in inner cities, and it was at play both before and after Vatican II. By the 60s, bishops and church leaders in Boston were lamenting the sorry state of the church in Roxbury. But by dumping abusive clergy in Roxbury, which again was not coincidentally also the site of the first 20th century Black neighborhoods in Boston, it was a situation that they had conspired to produce. The historical confluence of Vatican II and the war on poverty in the 1960s further turned inner cities like Roxbury into, in the eyes of church leaders, sort of new missionary frontiers, places where priests like Albany's Doja Wilson could be sent off to serve the poor and have his heart converted, or at the very least, make sure that he does not get sent to prison for a very long time. The people of St. Mary of the Angels in Roxbury were harmed by this geographical solution too. Recall that by 1938, Eggleston Square was already ethnically and religiously non-white enough to be redlined. During this period, the parish, St. Mary's, had the same abhorrent pastor for nearly 40 years. 40 years. Sometimes you get a certain pastor and you're like, okay, like 7-year clock starts now. 40 years from 1916 to 1953, so 37 years, despite files, again, archival research, reading dead people's mail, despite files filled with complaint letters about him from parishioners, from neighbors, from fellow priests who were assigned to work with him at St. Mary's. The records are hazy and filled with the typical sort of high levels of euphemism about what this priest, Father Finnegan's, serious problems actually were. But it was very clear, even in the archival records available to me from the Archdiocese, that at the very least, this was a very verbally, perhaps physically abusive, very unwell person. 40 years he was there. And so here we see, well before Vatican II, well before the publicized stories of clergy abuse with which we've sort of publicly reckoned in the media, bishops were already habitually treating small, poor urban parishes as dumping grounds for problem clergy, shuffling harmful priests off to already precarious communities. Church leaders participated in the production of the very inner city, whose deprivation they would go on to lament. So what's the lesson here? The lesson is this, I think. Only a certain kind of mastery of space could make possible the geographic solution. This mastery enabled church leaders a kind of access to the world, the ability to send people away, the ability to bring people back, the ability to turn entire communities into collateral for harmful priests. Right? It's a sort of ecclesial colonial dynamic that is unbelievably haunting if we ponder it well enough. And again, another piece of this puzzle about what it means to study place in a real way, right? With open eyes, and not just to see a community as, oh, this community is so beautiful. Look at these local practices. What are the forces at work? What are the forces at work? So the third wound I want to name today, and that is the wound of parish closure. I'm really actually kind of curious. Raise your hand if you or the parish maybe that your family goes to or your own parish has been closed or merged at some point in the last, I don't know, couple decades. That's more than a few, right? So this is, and it's hard. Sometimes it's a long time coming, but I think more frequently it's really hard. It's a really hard thing for people to deal with. I'll kind of illustrate why I want to name this as well. So I'll tell a final story, third and final story. So in the morning of May 25th, 2004, Father Dave Gill answered a knock at the parish house door of St. Mary of the Angels Catholic Church. This was how many years before I lived there? Several, 6 or something. He unlatched the heavy wooden door to find a FedEx delivery man standing on the front porch with a letter from Archbishop Sean O'Malley. After careful consideration and an extensive process and review, it read, I am writing to inform you that I have decided that St. Mary of the Angels Parish must close. It went on. The small number of worshipers and the relatively low sacramental index have led me to conclude that the pastoral and spiritual needs of the people of God at St. Mary of the Angels Parish can be appropriately served by the remaining parishes in the area. Gill was stunned. Threats of a shutdown were nothing new to St. Mary's, which had been one of the smallest and poorest parishes in the city ever since it was established in 1906. The overall sense I got when doing this research is that it never should have been established in the first place. It was carved out of the territory of a larger parish, and it was established in this sort of spate of parish building in the early 1900s when they thought, oh, there's a big Catholic future for Boston, which there was, but not in Roxbury. And it became immediately apparent to this church that they should probably not have been established when they couldn't even raise the money to build the church on top. They built the sanctuary in the basement, and they couldn't, in a couple years, they couldn't raise any money to build the top of the church, so they built a roof over it. Over the basement, and it's still like that. It's still a basement with a roof. They never built the top of the church, and it's like 120 years old, and it's beautiful, right? So it's a basement church. It's an underground church. It's very subversive, right? But also it's like in a basement. So everybody's like, I thought there was a church around here, and you're like, yeah, no, it's the one with the little stairs that go down. So it's a very small parish, and there had been many points throughout its history in which it was threatened with closure because it was small, because it was poor, because it was barely self-sustaining. But after almost a century of precarity, the parish at this point was actually thriving. Things in Eggleston Square were as good as they'd been in decades. The parish's social justice and religious education and youth ministries were flourishing. Everyone in Boston knew that church shutdowns were coming. It was part of a very long, drawn-out, several-year process. But St. Mary's hadn't been recommended for closure during that process. And an official visit and review by the Archdiocese less than 2 years earlier reported a glowing praise for the parish. So people were very, very shocked. Since mid-century or so, as we noted, the church had been serving parishioners from dozens and dozens of nations. They'd spent decades ministering to families on all sides of neighborhood gang violence. The interracial and intercultural and joyfully collaborative nature of the church's community was really something unlike anything else that existed anywhere else in the city. So parishioners really kind of assumed they were safe from closure, and they were wrong. Pastors all around the city opened their rectory doors that morning to similar news. Letters had gone out to all 357 parishes in the Archdiocese informing them of their fates. And of them, 64 received the same verdict as St. Mary's. They were going to close their doors by that fall. Another 20 churches in nearby Lawrenceville and Lowell received the same news in a separate decision. The morning of the announcement, Archbishop O'Malley held a press conference expressing sympathy for the nearly 30,000 Boston Catholics whose parishes had learned of their impending closures that day. He emphasized the inevitability of the shutdowns. Like many once thriving centers of Catholic life in the Northeast, 21st century Boston was burdened with a surfeit of aging buildings, declining mass attendance, and an increasingly dire clergy shortage. Oversaturated with unsustainable infrastructure, closures seemed inevitable. Something had to give. But the closures were also part of a larger and, again, kind of a darker story in the Archdiocese of Boston. In January 2002, of course, the Boston Globe broke its first spotlight report detailing the massive cover-up of clergy abuse, of sexual abuse by clergy, while leaders maintained that closing parishes had nothing to do with paying abuse settlements. The money the Archdiocese received from the sale of land and buildings was part of this larger restructuring plan aimed ultimately at saving the Archdiocese from total financial ruin. So the parish closures were really kind of salt in the wounds of people already really aching from a sense of betrayal and more sensitized than ever to the destructive force of institutional secrecy and abuses of power. Additionally, it soon became clear that parish closures didn't affect all communities equally. Large, wealthy, well-staffed parishes in the suburbs and more upscale parts of the city were mostly spared. But by contrast, urban parishes serving poor and working class communities, including communities of color, were disproportionately targeted. And as Catholics in the Northeast, right, you know this too well. Behind the phenomenon of church closures, we encounter a host of really important questions that I think have deep ecclesiological implications, right? Whose places matter? Whose memories and histories are worth preserving? And when we ask that, what we're really asking is whose stories do we see as central to the big story, and whose stories do we see as footnotes? Certain configurations of places tell certain kinds of stories. When institutional leaders edit the devotional map of an entire city, that institution is making choices about whose stories matter, whose histories matter, and also whose future matters. Now, as I noted in the beginning, as a spoiler alert, St. Mary's protest against closure was ultimately successful. But the larger legacy of parish closures in the Archdiocese of Boston and dioceses like this one and the diocese that many of you are from, I think I can gesture toward this kind of an ambivalence that has to enter in when we think about what it means to belong to the local church. Right? Whenever we study the local church, and I'm concluding here, we're always at risk of nostalgia taking over, right? This sort of yearning for a better, truer, purer, simpler, more honest and hardworking version of whatever the present happens to be, crystallized, right, in the way things used to be. Politically and philosophically, that yearning takes on a variety of forms, whether it's a sort of post-liberal radical turn to the small inward-looking community as a defensive bulwark against secularism, or an exaggerated quasi-libertarian embrace of Catholic social teaching's principle of subsidiarity, or a Wendell Berry-esque form of romantic agrarianism. In different ways, each of these forms of hyper-localism downplay the genealogies of conquest and colonization and economic decision-making that produce the places that we call home in church today. We become better scholars, and I think better Christians, both when we commit to doing theology grounded in real, concrete places, and also when we shake off the gauzy treatment that place typically gets in theology. Thinking theologically from some real, actual flesh and blood place requires that we work historically and archivally and politically and decolonially. Places aren't innocent. They don't just appear, they're made. So to do theology from a place requires scrutinizing histories of migration and transnationalism, of shifting boundaries, of development and rezoning, of redlining, of colonization, and of conquest. It requires us to confront the things that we don't want to know in service of the church that we want to bring into being. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reynolds. That was very rich. You may know that half of my class is doing reports on this book, and so they now have a big background to do those reports against. I do just want to take a moment to thank the O'Callahan family who is here tonight. It is their energy and their donors who have kept this lecture alive. We are in the 24th year of the Anne Drummy O'Callahan Lecture Series. We are so grateful. It's been wonderful. I have to mention that, didn't Anne study with Elizabeth Johnson? Did she know her? Yes. So who was the first lecturer in this series, and I think Anne would have been very happy to hear your voice. She was very committed to the parish and parish education. I think she would have been very happy to hear what you said today here. So that's a wonderful thing. We have time now for a few questions. I do have to say that, you kept saying this phrase, conspired to produce. And so if I was in my class, I would write that down on my hand maybe, because it's such a wonderful, seriously, it's such a wonderful way of talking about how social forces work, that things don't just appear, as Dr. Reynolds has said. Things that we think are true always have been, things have happened to make it so. And the way you illustrated this was very helpful for us, and I appreciate that. I wondered, I'm just going to ask, this is just a question of information for our audience. You referred to the sacramental index and how important that is to bishops when they assess the viability of a parish. What do you mean by that?
Great question. Thank you for inviting me to explain absolutely the most boring thing in the entire world.
You're welcome.
The Sacramental Index is an algorithm, but not a cool algorithm, there is some math involved that I cannot invoke from memory right now, and it's not straightforward at all. But it's basically a number that is made up of how many baptisms take place in a parish, how many... probably first communions. I don't think weddings is in there. Could be weddings. But basically, it's like how, on paper, on tally marks, how many sacraments are happening in your parish. And this is supposed to be sort of a proxy for the vibrancy or the viability of your parish, which, of course, and it's not sort of prorated. It's not like sacraments per person. It's like, it's kind of it's a number. And so it's not like per capita. And so what does that do? It privileges large parishes, which are good. Large parishes are lovely. But also at the same time, does that mean that communities that are small, communities that are poor churches for the poor, that have always been small, that exist on the peripheries, are these not parishes worth preserving? So it's a problematic number in many respects.
I would love to do a study of this with the Gini figure in economics, actually, and where that assesses the viability of something. And, and of course, what we see here is with parishes and lower income communities, the family structure that produces the people who are put, with people driving minivans to sacramental activities, are under strain in lower income communities. And so that number, of course, is going to shift. So it would be an interesting study for someone who can do a lot more math than I.
Or I.
Okay, good. So do we have any questions here from the audience? Yes, sir, please. I'm going to bring the mic over to you. And
My name is Bob Dennehy, and my wife Judy. We both come from Boston. I look at that map and wondering where the street is that I grew up on. I see Jamaica Pond. It wasn't too far from that.
Oh, wow.
And Blessed Sacrament Church was one of the churches that closed.
Sacrament, yes.
It was more like Basilica.
Yeah.
And it still stands rotting
It's
today.
still there, yeah.
Yeah, rotting. Nothing is happening to it. It's just awful. A couple of things about place first. That when I was growing up, all these breweries and bottling plants surrounded me.
Yes.
And I grew up on the border of Jamaica Plain and Roxbury.
Okay, yep.
And so I realized that we were sitting on the biggest aquifer in Massachusetts. And therefore, they drew all the water until they got city water. And in fact, work for Canada Dries. So that I guess I think if there was a place that seems to me to be an area because it determined a lot of the commercial activity in the area as well. The other question though that struck me is that I looked at the title of the overall lecture on women in the church. My sense is that we wouldn't have this lecture tonight from a man, correct? Because you had access to information that no one else would get. All those files that you had at the church would not be available. Mm-hmm. And so that is very helpful to us, I thought. And therefore, I'm just pleased that you were able to come and present this information to us. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I was talking to Mary Kate also before, and I said, I realize I don't do a lot of feminist theology in this, but and she said, well, you're a woman in the church. And I said, yeah, I'm a woman in the church. But I think there is something about being trained as a feminist theologian, which I am, that puts you in the mindset of not taking things at face value and saying there's a story under the story here. And often the more limited access that women have to the church institutionally invites a kind of creativity to say, what are other ways I can get this information? What are other ways I can learn about this? And I just so appreciate your story of this basically is the borderline. St. Mary's is right on the borderline between Jamaica Plain and Roxbury. But your note about Blessed Sacrament is so interesting. A friend of mine who teaches at Kalamazoo College, Alyssa Maldonado Estrada, was part of a program that teamed scholars with journalists, and they wrote a story that was published in a publication in Boston, actually, I think an online publication. And the title of it is so perfect, and I love assigning it because I love the title. It's something about the closed church to luxury condo pipeline, that's there are two things, right? And this is the same in Atlanta, actually. Either the buildings sit empty and rotting, and these used to be centers of the community, and now what are we doing with this space? We're just letting it languish, or we're selling it to developers. And they are turning this land into multi-million-dollar luxury condos that the people who live in the neighborhood could never dream of affording. And so there's a wrenching reality to that too. There's a lot lost when a church closes.
Thank you so much for that. That's very helpful. I have two questions for my students, and so Nick, do you have a mic for them? Yes. Go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Kendall.
Hi.
I just had a question. So I know you went to Boston College, what led you to choose Boston College? Was there a moment? And then was there something that happened at Boston College that led you to choose the career and path you're on now?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I went to Boston College for grad school, but I went to Notre Dame for undergrad.
Hey. We're gonna have a fight.
We have a very confusing football team this year. No, love Notre Dame. Met my husband there, so good. Love the Notre Dame. But I went, so after I graduated from undergrad, I was part of a postgraduate service program called Alliance for Catholic Education. And so it's kind of like Catholic Teach for America. So I was sent to Brownsville, Texas, which is the southernmost tip of Texas, to teach middle school language arts and social studies in a small, under-resourced Catholic school. And I fell in deep, deep love with the border space, especially the Rio Grande Valley. And I wanted to keep studying theology and migration. Well, initially I thought I want to keep teaching, but I want to teach theology or religion. So I'll go get a master's in theology. And I ended up at Boston College because I applied to a lot of grad schools and got into all of them. And my fiance applied to one grad school and got into that grad school. And we decided to go to Boston College. And at first I was like, I don't really like this because it's hard to make decisions with other people without feeling like you're compromising something. But it ended up being absolutely the best place imaginable because there I met and worked for all my entire master's and PhD with the soon-to-be lecturer, Hoffman Espino, who was my dissertation advisor. And he, at the time, was doing a study, not so much an ethnographic study, but like more of a survey study of Catholic parishes with Hispanic ministry. And he had never done anything like this before. And also, for some reason, well, I think he really wanted to make sure it was accessible, but it was very analog. It was like thousands of envelopes that we were stuffing in his office all summer. It was insane, and it was unwieldy, and it was really beautiful for me to watch a professor kind of like do something for the first time. You think like, oh, people are just experts at things. But he was a professor. He was, like in a tenure track. I think he wasn't quite tenured at that point. But he was like, oh, I want to do this survey, and I'm probably going to make a lot of mistakes. But I'm going to do this thing that nobody's done before. And it was very inspiring to me. And I felt very empowered by that. I felt like I can really imagine a place for myself in the academy in the future. But yeah, one thing led to another, and I found myself living at a church because I didn't have any money, mostly. And they were like, do you want to live here for free? And I was like, absolutely. I absolutely do. And that is a community that led me to ask all of these much larger questions and became the subject of my dissertation research. And it was a lot of life stuff, honestly. It was a kind of like, okay, what's the next question I have? It's a good question.
That's a great answer. Joe, were you waving? Yeah.
I want to thank you, pardon me, I want to thank you for your contribution because it raises a whole lot of interesting questions. I grew up in Philadelphia, and I remember my parish was, I lived there from all the way through high school, I guess, and college. But anyway, they eventually merged it with another parish, and then a few years ago, they sold it. And it's now the Academy of Circus Arts in Philadelphia. And I can look online and see a picture of the interior of my church with all the kind of trapeze stuff hanging from the ceiling,
Wow.
So,
Wow. So that's what you do with the cathedral ceiling, I guess. Wow, that is so interesting.
but the other thing I was thinking about is I read Maureen O'Connell's book.
Yes.
In which she talks about growing up in Philadelphia and it being a very segregated place, and the Irish who came into the city and the Irish bishops who ran the city and the Irish clergy took all the attitudes of the broader community about those other people, the race, the black people. We don't have anything to do with them. So there was a real sense of tremendous segregation there.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say that my brother Dennis was older than me, but he became a priest in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia.
Wow.
And he served in a lot of parishes, and then eventually he became the pastor of a black parish in Chester, Pennsylvania. And when he came in there, the people in the parish said, okay, how long are you going to be here? And he said, I expect to die here, which kind of threw them for a loop. But anyway, he became very much involved in working with that community of people. They were black people. Some of them, actually, I remember this, there were some of them from Louisiana, and they were women who had gone to Xavier University in Louisiana. And she, at one point, talked about how growing up down there was such a real burden because she'd go to Mass, and the black people had to wait till the white people went to communion. And she found that very distressing.
Very
So anyway, my
distressing.
brother's working with this parish, but he's also working with the broader community, with all the black ministers in the city, and they're working against an administration in a city which is corrupt and racist and everything like that. And eventually, what happens, two things. First of all, there's tensions in the school. His school is all black kids with white nuns, and there's tension between them on that account. And eventually, reports get back to the diocese that there's problems in this place. There's also, he's an outspoken on city affairs, and the politicians begin to complain. The upshot of all this, my brother gets fired by the Archbishop of Philadelphia, Cardinal Kroll. And he refuses to resign because Cardinal Cole won't tell him who accused him of failing to do marriages and weddings and all the rest of that kind of stuff, you know. So anyway, it reminds me of Andrew Greeley makes a comment at some point or other, when are we going to stop abusing our priests? Now, the last thing I would say is this. You were talking about parishes, and I remember my wife, Ann, was a DRE in our parish, and at one point, first of all, I should say the parish is in Norwalk, built in 1950, I think, and they built the school building, and then they built a gym adjacent to that, but they needed a church, so they turned the church into a gym. And so that's what it is today. Anyway, I remember she was telling me about a priest from the diocese came to visit and looking at the place and talking about it. And he said, it's terrible. I just tear it down. And she said, it's not the building, it's the people. And I was thinking about that old gesture, you know, this is the church, this is the steeple, and these are the people.
Yes.
And it brings you back to the basic issue. People in the very beginning, they were people, Christians in somebody's house. You know, they weren't in a church. So we're in that kind of a changed circumstance, and I don't think that the bishops yet have kind of come to grips with that. In fact, the Pope has pretty much said that.
I don't think
Okay,
most of
I'll
us
stop
have.
talking.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, I was thinking of Sandra D. Williams' work, where she has been so thoughtful about the issue of race here in the
She's
United States
excellent.
today, and
Yeah.
mentioned some of those issues. I appreciate that, Joe. Yeah. Do I have any other? Yes, one last question here, please.
Hi, my name's Sasha, and I have a question regarding clergy abuse. I was just wondering what the Vatican has done in the present day to help get rid of it.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's been very interesting because, of course, and this is understandable. And I'm sure this is true of everyone, but I think it's particularly true of American Catholics. We really feel like we're the center of the universe, and everything that's happening in the American Catholic Church is like the most important thing that's happening in the whole church. And the disagreements that are happening in the American Catholic Church are like the disagreements that are happening everywhere. And then I'm always very shocked to be reminded that that's not the case. And the big struggle on the global scale in terms of clergy abuse is not even so much the kind of things that you see here of like reporting procedures and policies and this and that. It's convincing a good portion of church leaders from throughout the world that clergy abuse isn't just a sort of Western problem. In a lot of, and this is painting with a broad brush, but it's fairly fair characterization. In the church, especially in the places where the church is growing the fastest, there's often a very vocal accusation that clergy abuse is completely bound up with homosexuality. It's a homosexuality problem, and homosexuality is a Western problem. That's not something that we deal with here in our context, and so clergy abuse is happening in Europe, Western Europe. It seems to be happening in the United States, but it's not happening here, and that's not our problem. And so it seems like a small thing, but it actually was a big thing that in 2019, February 2019, Pope Francis called basically a massive global meeting of church leaders on the topic of clergy sexual abuse. And the document that came out of that, and also even just the things that happened in real time, the statements that were made, basically that was kind of the bottom line of saying, this is not a U.S. problem, this is not a West problem, this is an everybody problem, this is happening in your diocese, this is happening on your continent, and so we're putting in place a skeletal reporting procedures, but global procedures nonetheless, that are applicable throughout the world. And so that, I think, has been kind of the starting point. There are now Vatican officials who are sort of in the terminology that's used institutionally as safeguarding. It's hard. There's been a lot of infighting. People think it's not moving fast enough. People think it's not, as one would reasonably imagine. But I think the challenge there, again, is trying to right a ship that's so big and where like a very large portion of the crew are like, this is not our problem and we're not going to look at it. So the flip side of the exposés that have come out in the United States is that we are looking at it. And that's good, given the reality.
You said it would be a fairly sober lecture, and indeed it was. I want to thank you for coming this evening, but before I say goodbye, it's my custom to name next year's speaker for this very day, the first Wednesday in October. And on that day, I'm thrilled to announce that the speaker for the 25th Anne Drummy O'Callaghan Lecture will be Heidi Schlumpf, the senior correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. Wouldn't that be fun? Who will speak on women in the church from her many years writing and thinking and reporting on the church in the Catholic media.
That's so cool.
So I am going to see you in a couple of weeks for our next lecture, but when you get that calendar at Christmas, those of you who are with us year in and year out, you just circle that first Wednesday in October for the 25th Annual Anne Drummy O'Callaghan Lecture. Thank you so much, Professor Reynolds.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much.